I invite you to pick up your Bibles and turn over with me to the end of Job chapter 38. And as you're turning over there, I'll just remind you, it's been a couple weeks since we've looked at our series of lessons. We're looking at a series of lessons that basically try to go through the entire Bible. We're at the point of Job right now, and I made mention of, up to this point, I've really tried to stick with the outline that they gave us to achieve that 8-year goal. However, the book of Job only had 3 lessons in it, and thus far we've looked at 7. 8 will be this week, and Lord willing, next week we'll do number 9, and that should be the end of it. Now, I don't anticipate any of those 2 subjects that I have ready for next week going longer than 1 lesson, but it could turn into that. And after that, I promise you I'll try to get right back on the schedule and follow the route that we're going on. But if you only get to study the book of Job 1 time in 8 years, I don't think 9 lessons overdoes it too much. So that's where we are in the point of our studies. And I do want to point out, too, last week we had DBS, so we didn't look at one of these lessons. And you might not have been with us the week before, or you might have, and you might be like me, and you slept a few times since then, and you kind of forgot what we were talking about, where we are in our studies. We began looking at Job chapter 38, and we looked at a lesson that was entitled A Good Dose of Humility. And what I pointed out to you in that chapter is basically chapter 38 is a series of questions that God asked Job to kind of get him to recognize not to step over the boundaries when it comes to his relationship with God and trying to proclaim his innocence and his righteousness and his being just over that of God's righteousness and innocence and justice. And so it's a very humbling set of questions that are asked to Job. That lesson, if you joined us in that study, I pointed out, it's not really structured. These couple of lessons this week too, they're not really structured like I would normally put a lesson together. Normally, you'd have this main point, and you'd have these other points, and you'd have these sub-points that go along with them. But we began a couple of weeks ago, and I warned you, I said the introduction is going to be kind of long, because that's really the heart of the lesson. And this week, it's going to be the same. Long introduction, okay? And basically what we're going to do after that is we're mainly going to read. And as we read, these questions are pretty self-explanatory, and you can kind of, I think, get the impression that it makes upon the mind of Job as God is asking them to him. And so the lesson title that I've chosen for this week is the lesson, or the title, So You Think You're Smart. Because sometimes as human beings, we get pretty proud, of the wisdom and the knowledge and the abilities that we gain in this life, and sometimes we start thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. And many times when we fall into that trap, what it does is it minimizes the importance and the role that other people play within our life. But we can also get to the point in our lives where we just don't think of God like we really ought to. We don't give him the place of honor and respect and reverence that we ought to give him within our lives. And if you look at our society today, I would venture to say that's kind of the place where we're at as a society, don't you? There's this idea in man's mind, there's this attitude, we might say, of haughtiness and arrogance against God. And there are untold millions in the world today that are just simply boldly rejecting God. They even question God's very existence. Some even deny the very existence of God himself. There are far too many of the people today who are challenging God. They're challenging his ways. They're throwing this question out over and over and over again about God. Well, why does this omnipotent, all-loving God, why does he allow so many things, bad things, to happen in the world today? And usually when somebody asks a question like that, they're really talking about, why does he allow bad things to happen in my life? And so there's this idea of where we're not really looking at God like we need to be looking at him. Where we're not really giving him this reverence and this honor and this respect that he deserves. And so what we're lacking is true humility. Now, I point those things out because as you read the conversation that takes place between Job and his three friends, I think you can safely say that there's some times in their conversation when they're pretty proud and pretty arrogant people. Even some of the things that Job says about himself are kind of presumptuous in nature. But we do want to point out, they've had this conversation and everybody knows everything about all that's happening in the world. That's basically the conversation that takes place between these four men. And so now it's time for God to confront this group of men. And that's exactly what God does. Now, as you read through Scripture here in chapters 38 through 41, it reads as if almost God and Job are alone, and God is just saying these things to Job. But what I want to remind you of, we know for a fact that Job's friends are sitting right by his side. Remember that they've come to visit him. There's no indication in the Scripture yet that they've left, but even after God ends his speech in chapter 42, the Bible tells us in verse 7 that it was so, after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz. So they're all here and they're sitting in this group and God is talking directly to Job, but also understand that his three friends are still there with him and they're hearing this conversation that's taking place between God and Job. These men, these three men, at least, they'd already run out of things to say, for sure. That's a good, safe assumption. But I think in their minds, they had already said everything that needed to be said. And so they were kind of done talking. They were done talking to Job. They were done debating with him. They were done arguing with him. They were done trying to see him to get him to see their logic and their reason that they were putting in these arguments. And so they had said everything that they were going to say. And what Job wanted God to speak. Remember that? He said, I want God to talk to me. You know, there's some questions that I have for God. There's some conversations that I want to have with God about what's happening in my life and, you know, how I'm a good person and I'm a righteous and innocent individual. And I just want him to talk to these things, or talk to me about these things. And that's what God does. Now, God may not have fully answered all the questions that Job had, but yet he did in a sense. But it's a very powerful conversation that he has with Job. And it's certainly something that Job would have never forgotten. His friends would have never forgotten. It was a life-changing conversation. So God speaks to Job. And I pointed out last week, or a couple weeks ago, God appears on the scene only as God can. God speaks to him out of a whirlwind. The King James Version says we would probably think of it more as maybe a miniature tornado or something like that, or a spin-up. So there's this giant or small whirlwind that comes spinning across the land. The Bible says it's just finished storming, and then it comes right up to Job, and out of that whirlwind or out of that tornado, God speaks to Job. And I often stop and think about, you know, why did God do that? And the reason that God did that is, again, it shows who he is, and it shows that it's actually God speaking, but it also gets the attention of these four men. You ever heard the story about the mild-mannered preacher who trained his stubborn donkey with a 2x4? That's the way that he trained him. He'd take that 2x4 and he'd just smack that donkey over the head as hard as he could. And there were some people that, you know, they kind of took exception to that, and eventually one of them worked up the courage, and they asked him, they said, how do you reconcile this idea that you're this meek, mild-mannered follower of God, and yet you're so violently beating this animal with this 2x4? And the preacher didn't miss a beat. He just turned to him and he said, listen here, this mule is so stubborn that sometimes you've got to get his attention. And you think about us as individuals, isn't that the way we are too? Sometimes we're so stubborn and we're so set in our ways that somebody has to do something to really get us to pay attention. And that's what God is doing. He comes to Job in this tornado and to his friends, and he speaks to them out of this tornado. The Lord brings to Job's mind, in the conversation that we're going to read about, 6 animals and 5 birds. And as he contemplates these creatures, here's what God wants Job to think about. Here's the questions that he wants them to answer. Do you understand the lifestyle of these animals? And not only do you understand them, but can you take care of them if I need you to? We, as humans, sometimes, again, we kind of lose sight of exactly where we are in life. I don't know about you, but I find it difficult to even maintain the mechanical things that I have in life. You know, a lot of times they're broken down. A lot of times there's some things that I have to do to them to kind of keep them up and maintain them and keep everything running smoothly. Could you imagine running the universe? Could you imagine taking care of this entire creation that God has made? I can't even keep up with the small mechanical things in my life. But that's really what this conversation is that God is having with Job. God runs and supervises this whole universe. And think about this. He does it in such a way that it is precise every second of every day. You can depend on it any time during any time of the day. That's how efficiently God runs this universe in which we live. And so you have this sequence that's unfolding in this conversation that God is having with Job. We looked at a couple of weeks ago, God is the creator of this universe, but now I think God turns his attention more to the idea, not only did I create all this universe, but I'm also taking care of it. I know how to run the universe. I know how to take care of things here in this life that you're living. And remember, one of the points that God makes to Job when he first shows up on the scene, and to us it may be kind of shocking, but he basically says, Job, you're ignorant, you're incompetent. Okay? When it comes to running this universe, you don't know the first thing about it. And it's not an insult on Job, because the same thing could be said about every one of us too, right? What if we were in charge of the universe for the day? What if we had to take care of it? How if we had to take care of all the animals in it and everything that's going on in it? We're just as ignorant and incompetent as a person can be when it comes to that area. And that's what God is telling Job through these series of questions. You're talking about spiritual matters. Specifically, you're talking about why do bad things happen to good people. You're talking about the idea of why do the righteous suffer here upon this earth. You're talking about things that you have no idea about. I know this universe, Job. I know how it works. I made it. I know how to operate it. You do not. And so don't think for a moment that what is happening to you is beyond my comprehension. Don't think for a moment that what is happening to you is beyond my control. Don't think for a moment that I am guilty of doing something bad to you that I shouldn't be doing. That's the lesson that God is trying to impart upon the mind of Job. And so the idea is this: if we're totally clueless about earthly things, and we are, we don't know squat about creating things. We don't know anything about running the universe and keeping everything in order. If we are totally clueless about earthly things, do we think we're full of knowledge when it comes to spiritual things? That was really what God was telling Job. And specifically, subjects like suffering. I know the Bible reveals to us certain things about suffering, and we can pick up on that and say, this is what God says. But as far as total comprehension of the idea and the outcome and the effect that it's going to have upon us in the next life, we don't know anything about it. But God does. And so Job has been quick in this conversation that he's had with his friends to say, I'm innocent, to say that I'm righteous, I'm not sinned, I've not done some bad things, that all these things should happen to me. But what he hasn't said is, God is innocent, and God is righteous, and everything that's happened to me is just. And so basically, he says, I want to talk to God. I've got some questions for him. I want to have some conversation. And God shows up and says, you want to talk to me? Do you realize who you're talking to? And so that's where we're picking up here in this study. And I'm going to do it just like I did it a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to kind of generalize these headings. And I want you to take your Bibles, if you will, and turn over with me to Job chapter 38. We're just going to read some of these verses. I'll make a few comments about them, but I think they're pretty well self-explanatory. I'm going to point out, as I did a couple of weeks ago, I'm not reading from the King James Version if you're following along. I'm reading from a version that's called The Message. I think it's obvious why I'm reading from it as we go along, as you can see. In chapter 38 and verse 39, though, here's God's conversation with Job? Can you teach the lioness to stalk her prey and satisfy the appetite of her cubs as they crouch in their den, waiting hungrily in their cave? And who sets out food for the ravens when their young cry to God, fluttering about because they have no food? The first thing that God talks about is this idea. Job, you think you know everything. You've been talking about all these things, and you think you have all this knowledge. Could you help me feed the lions and the ravens for a day? Can you help me out with that? The first thing that he kind of asks Job is, he says, would you even know when they're hungry? Could you even hear them crying? I can't. Can you hear those cubs crying in their den? Well, you don't have that ability, do you, Job? And even if you could, what are you going to do for them? How are you going to provide them with food? He says, I'll tell you what I did. I taught the lion how to stalk its prey. I taught the lion how to kill something so that it would have something to eat and so that it could take that food and bring it back to their cubs so that they could be provided with food. What are you going to do for that lion, Job? You going to teach them how to stalk their prey too? And not only that, he said, the ravens. What about the ravens? How are you going to feed them? Well, he said, I set all these things up. I taught the ravens how to know where a carcass is. I've taught the ravens that after a lion makes a kill, how they can seek those things out and how they can have food, and that food can provide for them and also for their young ones too. In other words, God's saying, I taught them how to eat. I taught them so that they would not starve to death. Did you do that, Job? Could you do that if you were in my shoes? The second set of questions begin in chapter 39. And he says in verse 1, he said, do you know the month when the mountain goats give birth? Have you ever watched a doe bear fawn? Do you know how many months she is pregnant? Do you know the season of her delivery, when she crouches down and drops her offspring? Her young ones flourish and are soon on their own way, and they leave and don't come back. You know, again, Job is supposed to have all this knowledge about what's happening to him, the things that are going on behind the scenes. And so God says, let me ask you a question here about mountain goats. Do you know the gestation period of mountain goats? You know, I thought about that. I thought, I have no clue. So they were to come up and to ask me the question, do you know how long the gestation period is for a mountain goat? No. Do you know how long the gestation period is for a deer? I like to hunt deer and I like to eat deer, but as far as the gestation period, I know nothing about it. You guys might know something about it. But he says, can you tell me about that? How did you carefully calculate that out, Job? How did you know just the amount of time that those babies needed to develop and to stay within their mother's womb? How did you know the right time? When were they ready to come forth out of that womb? And how did you set up the process through which all that would happen? You know, sometimes as farmers and even as many people back then would have been shepherds, we assist our animals through the birth process, don't we? We kind of oversee that and look at who assists the mountain goat in the birth process. Who assists a deer in the birth process? Well, they're all out here on their own. How does it work? How are those things able to come about? How do those little ones grow up safely? How do their moms know how to take care of them? You taught them how to do that, didn't you, Job? You know, you're so smart and you know have all the answers to these things. How do they know when they're ready to leave home? You ever think that? How does the mother know when it's time to run those babies that she's had off and to get them away from her, and that they're going to be able now to survive on their own? Did Job teach those wild animals how to do those things? Did he instill in them that knowledge? God says, how do you know how long they need to be nurtured before they can fend for themselves? Surely you know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to any of those questions. But again, God is showing the difference between being God and being a man. The third set of questions deal with verses 5 through 12. And it basically revolves around, again, some of the other wild animals. In verse 5, he says, who do you think set the wild donkey free? Open the corral gates and let him go. I gave him the whole wilderness to roam in, the rolling plains and the wide open spaces. He laughs at his city cousins who are harnessed and harried. He's oblivious to the cries of his teamsters. He grazes freely through the hills, nibbling anything that's green. Will the wild buffalo condescend to serve you, volunteer to spend the night in your barn? Can you imagine hitching your plow to a buffalo and getting him to till your fields? He's hugely strong, yes, but could you trust him? Would you dare turn the job over to him? Well, you wouldn't for a minute depend upon him, would you? To do what you said and when you said it? Again, God talks about these animals, and he talks about their behavior, and he talks about the ability that he has to control these animals. And he tells Job, are you the one who made the donkey wild? Are you the one, this version says buffalo. A lot of people think it's talking about the ox here, but very powerful animal either way. A lot of times when we think about animals, because of our society, we often think about them in a very domesticated sense. But there were wild animals, still wild animals today. Things and species that we have tamed within our society that still roam freely in other places of the earth. And God particularly starts talking about donkeys. How in the world could a donkey survive out here in the wilderness without any human assistance? How could he survive if you didn't take care of him, Job? Oh, that's right, I'm taking care of him, right? I'm providing for him. I've set him up in a way that he can survive here upon this earth. How can he survive? Because God taught him how to do it. God instilled that wisdom and that knowledge within that animal. Think about how stubborn a donkey is. Can you just walk up to a donkey and say, now go back in my barn and spend the night? Will he listen to you, Job? Could you walk up to a wild ox or even a wild buffalo and say, now I'm going to hitch my plow to you. You go out there and plow my field. Will he listen to you, Job? Because God says, I'll guarantee you if I tell him, he'll listen to me. Do you have that power? Do you have that control? Do you know how to care for creation like I do? Will he listen to, will any of these wild animals listen to you? Will you depend upon them to do whatever you tell them to do? You won't, Job, because you're a human. I can tell them what to do and they'll do it because I am God. In verses 13 through 18, he talks about a very odd creation of God. In verse 13, it's translated various ways in different versions and translations. But the message says this: the ostrich flaps her wings futilely. All those beautiful feathers, but useless. She lays her eggs on the hard ground. She leaves them there in the dirt, exposed to the weather, not caring that they might get stepped on and cracked or trampled by some other wild animal. She's negligent with her young as if they weren't even hurt. She cares nothing about them. She wasn't created very smart, that's for sure. She wasn't given her share of good sense. But when she runs, oh, how she runs, laughing and leaving the horse and rider in the dust. You ever think about some of the animals that God created? The bizarre anatomy of those animals, the bizarre behavior of some of those animals, and how some of these animals, their anatomy and their behavior with similar animals is just completely the opposite? And you ever stop and think about why in the world? Why in the world do they have those characteristics but they don't really use them? Why in the world do they act so strangely? Why do they act so oddly? Well, as humans, we're still studying and we're still trying to figure out why they have that bizarre anatomy and why they behave in such an odd way. But listen, God knows why. You know why he knows? Because he made them. And there's a purpose in his creation. Think about the ostrich. Think about it. Why would God create a bird that had wings but couldn't fly? Does that make any sense? All those feathers and then the wings, but it can't fly? And then you think about what it does. When it flaps the wings, it doesn't take off. It just fans the air. That's all it does when it flaps those wings. Think about how bizarre its behavior is when it comes to animal instinct. A mother toward her babies or her children. Most animals will defend their babies or their children with their lives. But she goes out here and just lays her eggs and runs off and leaves them and depends upon the sand to keep them warm and for them to hatch out. And even if she does, when she comes back and she spends some time with them, she's not attached to them. One of them could die right in front of her face and she'd never even pay a lick of attention to it. Not like many other animals within the animal world. And we as humans look at that and we say, that's the stupidest animal I ever seen. You know, that's the most useless animal that exists here upon the face of the earth. Until we see her run. And then we say, oh boy, How can she run? I don't know how fast an ostrich can run. I looked it up. It said up to 43 miles per hour the ostrich can run, outrunning many horses, outrunning many other animals within the world. And God says this, why'd you make that animal, Job? Why'd you come up with this silly bird? How'd you come up with this design? What's the purpose of it? Explain to me so you can impart knowledge and wisdom to me. Oh yeah, you don't know anything about that, do you? Because I made that bird. In the next few verses, beginning in verse 19, God talks about the horse. In beginning there, he says, "Are you the one who gave the horse his prowess and adorned him with a shimmering mane? Did you create him to prance proudly and strike terror with his royal snorts? He paws the ground fiercely, eager and spirited, then charges into the battle. He laughs at danger, fearless, doesn't shy away from the sword. The banging and clanging of the quiver and the lance don't faze him. He quivers with excitement, and at the trumpet blast he races off at a gallop. At the sound of the trumpet he neighs mightily, smelling the excitement of the battle from a long way off, catching the rolling thunder of the war cries." The description of a horse that we're reading about here, of course we're not reading about a farm animal, but we're reading about a way that many people in that day used a horse, and that was as a weapon of war. We're not reading about a domesticated animal. We're not reading about, well, domesticated in some sense, but not the same sense as a farm animal. But we're reading about an animal that has been trained. An animal that knows at the command of his rider exactly what to do. He knows when to prance. He knows when to walk. He knows when to run. And the amazing thing about these animals that you read about them when they were used during times of war and how they were trained, they were eager. They were eager to run in the battle. I mean, a lot of humans would have been like, I don't think this is a good idea, you know. Or we might be a little bit outnumbered today. But those war horses, they were like, let's go. When the trumpet sounded, when they heard the battle cry, when they smelled the war, they couldn't get there fast enough. And think about all the distractions that were going on, all the sword clanging that would have been going on, all the arrows that would have been whizzing through the air, all the javelins and things that would have been going, all the shouting of men, and yet they were trained with tremendous focus, where all these noises never distracted. They just kept their eyes on the battle, and they kept on showing their strength and their courage. How are they able to serve so effectively on the battlefield? God says, Job, did you put that strength in that horse? Did you teach that horse how to be courageous? Did you create this animal? Do you understand how it works? Can you take care of him if you need to? Can you teach him these qualities if it comes down to it? No, you can't. Because you're just a human. And I'm God. The last set of questions revolve around some birds. In verse 26, God says to Job, he says, was it through your know-how that the hawk learned to fly, soaring effortlessly on thermal updrafts? Did you command the eagle's flight and teach her to build her nest in the heights, perfectly at home on the high cliff face, invulnerable on pinnacle and crag? From her perch she searches for prey, spies it at a great distance. Her young gorge themselves on carrion. Wherever there's a roadkill, you'll see her circling. You know, you think about those two birds, the hawk and the eagle, some of the most amazing birds that you can study within the animal kingdom. But one of the things that's so amazing is how high they soar and they glide above the earth. You ever seen a hawk or an eagle, you know, or even a vulture? Some people think it should be translated as vulture. I don't think so because of where the nest is located. But have you ever seen them fly way up high in the air? Does it look like they're struggling? Does it look like they're taking everything that it can for them to you know, make their way across the sky? Man, it just looks like they're just gliding back and forth, doesn't it? He says, did you teach the hawk how to fly, Job? Did you teach the eagle about the thermal updrafts and how they can use them to their advantage and how they can just glide in the sky where they don't really even have to flap their wings or work very hard? They can just change their weight and their direction and they can go where they want to go. Did you build those animals, Job? You know how they work? Can you teach them to do those things? Did you teach the eagle to build her nest high up on the edge of a cliff? And yet you think about all these things, they're so far, they're so high above us, but yet the amazing thing about these birds is their eyesight. The hawk is said to have the best vision within the animal kingdom of any other animal, the hawk. You ever seen a hawk? Maybe you're out in the field and maybe you're mowing your yard or something. You see this bird that's sitting in the top of a tree, or maybe it's even flying. And you think, what in the world is that thing doing? I mean, like that, it's got a mouse in the middle of this field that's grown up this tall. How can it do that? It's because it's eyesight, its ability to see. As humans, the best vision, or the best vision, I guess, that we're supposed to have is 20/20 vision. And basically, that means if something is 20 feet away from you, you can see it very clearly. Scientists within the animal kingdom tell us that the hawk has at least 24 vision. And that means basically that a hawk, where we would see clearly at 20 feet, at 100 feet, the hawk can see very clearly. It's just like us looking at something at 20 feet. Some would even say that its vision is 8 times better, which means that at 160 feet, it sees like we see at 20 feet. Amazing vision. Scientists who have studied the hawk say that it sees colors and contrast in the human nature, in the natural world, that we can't even begin to pick up on. And so it has this very keen eyesight. And God says, Job, can you teach a hawk to see like that? Can you teach an eagle to see like that? Could you teach them how to fly? You think about these questions here. These are all questions just about the animal kingdom in general. And what I take away from especially this lesson is, I think individually, and you might agree with this too, but I know personally as an individual, I take too little time to gaze upon, to ponder, and to stand in awe of God's creation. I mean, when you stop and you look at the things around us, whether it be the forces of nature, whether it be the beauty of creation, or even the mystery of the animal world, the vast array of living things that exist around us, the vast array of non-living things, they all bear testimony to the infinite wisdom and the infinite power and the infinite glory of God. And I think it would behoove us all, me especially, to take some time every once in a while to pause, to look around, to reflect upon the magnitude of creation that exists, to reflect upon the complexity of creation within the animal world, and just to try to understand how great God is. Could we even begin to conceive of an animal kingdom like exists in our world today? Could you ever even come up with this idea and this food chain and all the different animals, all the different fish, all the different things that the animals that walk on land, all the different birds that fly in the air? Could you even begin to conceive of something like that? And even if you could, could you ever make anything like that? Even if we could come up with this idea, there's no way we could ever make all those animals. And even if we could make all those animals, then could you care for them? Could you make sure that they survive and that they have a place here upon this earth and that everything works like it's supposed to work? Listen, only God can do something that wise. Only God can do something that powerful and something like that that's so amazing. And so here's the lesson that I want for us to take from it. And I think this is the point that God's making to Job. Does God know what he's doing? Yeah. We may not know, okay? We may not see and we may not comprehend, but does God know what he's doing? The answer is yes. Can you trust God to take care of everything that he makes? Yeah. He's taking care of all the animals in the animal world. He doesn't just create something and then let it go or not know how to take care of it. Listen, if God knows what he's doing and he takes care of whatever he makes, what does that say about our life as humans? Does God know what's going on in our lives? Is he taking care of it? Does he know what's happening? Does he understand it all? Yes. And so the lesson for us is not to question God. That's not our place. We don't have the smarts to even begin to have a conversation with God. But we do have the ability to trust him. we do have the ability to know that he can create everything and that he knows how to take care of it. And that's what living the Christian life is about. No matter what happens, we're going to trust God because he knows what he's doing. And that's what he's telling Job. Listen, I know there's some bad things that are happening in your life. I know there's a difficult situation. I know you're suffering. Just trust me. And if you trust me, in the end, everything's going to work out for your good. Maybe you're a person here in our audience this morning